When I was invited here, I knew how much I would learn. When I looked at the agenda, it was clear to me, not being an engineer, not studying resiliency, how much I would learn. But more importantly, what I looked forward to was being inspired. And I knew I would be with a group of sustainability professionals that are putting their heads and their hearts together to solve some of the world's most complex environmental and social challenges. But what surprised me, as Tom alluded to in the last couple of days, is what I didn't expect was the passion and the intensity around really applying your work. And that's not common. The level of commitment that I've seen here during the last 3 days about creatively figuring out ways to accelerate and scale your work is exceptional. So it's inspired me, I'm energized, and I'm honored to give this final talk. So I was inspired and surprised by Gary Dirks talking about trying to raise or reach 100 million people. I was inspired and surprised by Tom Seeger and Dave Woods talking about raising $25 million just as a start to apply these projects across the country. But most of all, I've really been inspired by the awesome cohort in the PhD program. Johnny and Camilla and Margaret and Susan and Marcus and Caitlin and all of you that I didn't get a chance to meet. I couldn't say more forcefully that I really respect what you're doing. And I think, when I think about a theme, I'm going to resist talking about models and theories in my talk because I think we've had a lot of those over the last 3 days. But I couldn't resist one last little model, and I'm now going to call it the 5 C's, which is creativity, courage, which are the 2 main themes that I'm going to talk about today, but communication, culture, and the culture that you have here in this program here at ASU is exceptional. One of the things I talk about is how in sustainability, mostly it's saddlebag sustainability. It's usually bolted on the outside of business programs in particular. But here at ASU, and especially in an engineering school, the extent to which you're integrating a mindset of sustainability is exceptional. So here's one more image that also came up in the last day. This is, for those of you who don't know, a picture of Steph Curry, who's one of the world's most extraordinary basketball players of all time. And even in the NBA, they're talking about sustainability. I was watching the game, and they had just beaten the Portland Trail Blazers the night before, 2 nights before, and in the fourth quarter, the Blazers had fallen apart. And as the team came out into the fourth quarter, the announcer says, what Coach Terry Stotts of the Portland Trail Blazers is looking for from his team tonight is sustainability. And I thought, what can we do with this? I'm sitting here thinking about Steph Curry, and I'm thinking about sustainability, and I'm thinking about all of you, and really what it comes down to is Steph Curry, for me, is someone who defies the odds. What I find amazing about him is he consistently taps into some kind of extraordinary power and defies the odds. And so as I sit here and I think about ISST, and I think about this amazing work that all of you are doing, that's the question that I'm going to explore, is how can we defy the odds? Because when we really know that we're really up against extraordinary cultural and economic and environmental challenges. So I am having some fun with Steph Curry as someone who can inspire us. Whoop. So what I've found, and what my research shows, is that many of the most courageous and influential sustainability leaders are informed and empowered by their worldviews. And by understanding worldviews, we can tap into greater courage. We can also understand resistance. And we can get into a different way of thinking about how we can have impact with our work in sustainability. And one of the key capacities here that I think all of you kind of recognize is that, that seeing yourself in the system, both human organizational systems and ecological systems, is what is a capacity to really scale your impact. And this has to do, I think, with your work in resilience in a variety of ways. Now, I've talked about defying the odds. And the question is, what if we as change agents, because I'm going to ask you as we kind of close the conference, to think about yourselves more as change agents. You're scientists, you're engineers, you have your data, you have your empirical evidence. But I think in terms of really what's going to make a difference, in terms of applying your work and having impact, is to really anchor this capacity as a change agent, as a courageous sustainability leader, how you show up, how you communicate. And my invitation is to ask you is, what if we as sustainability change agents could really harness this power of shifting worldviews, of understanding how people think, of showing up differently when we're in these kind of stressful situations, and wouldn't that capacity of shifting worldviews be a tremendous power? And wouldn't it even be a type of superpower? So as I sit here, and I kind of got a kick out of Tom's socks, being the Superman socks, and I thought, you know, he's kind of a Superman. He really is. And I think there's other people in the sustainability movement that have inspired me that are really real-life Supermen. And so this is one that many of you know. He's kind of the iconic case study. He was the first CEO of a public company that put a stake in the ground for a zero ecological footprint. His name was Ray Anderson. And what was remarkable about him, and what I found really interesting, was not so much just what he did at Interface, but that he spoke about his motivation for sustainability in very personal and very spiritual terms. He was very out front talking about the epiphany he had about the world's ecological crisis, and very upfront that business needed to lead the way. And my conversation with him over lunch 10 years ago deeply inspired me to do the work I've done for the last 10 years. And I wanted to start with him as kind of a real-life Superman, because he's very, very important to all of us in the sustainability movement. So this is kind of his successor that's widely regarded in the business world. This is Paul Pullman, who's the CEO of Unilever, which is one of the world's largest consumer products company. And he also is a CEO that has been very, very vocal and upfront at the climate talks and in countless interactions with world governments about the need to redesign all products and services and supply chains to do no harm to the earth. And he's doing it while navigating that short-term economic environment of a public company. And so this is kind of a beginning of what I want to start to talk about, is what does motivate these types of leaders to be courageous, to be all in on sustainability? What is it that separates all of us in this room that are making a lifelong career commitment to a value called sustainability, and everybody else that we really want to change? And so this idea of navigating the short-term financial bottom line while consistently integrating mentally, social, and environmental connections is a part of a worldview that I want to suggest is what separates those of us that are completely committed to sustainability. So here's somebody else that when I think about scale and I start to think about what Gary Dirks was saying, and I think about what we're doing here at ISSST, that many of you may be aware, and I should say I'm not talking about Evo Morales here in this picture with his Che Guevara pin, which you may or may not be able to see, but I'm talking about Pope Francis. Pope Francis wrote the environmental encyclical last summer, which was addressed to the world's 1.1 billion Catholics, but it's actually one of the most extraordinary descriptions of sustainability leadership and ecological worldviews that we've had. And it ended up influencing 195 countries to sign the Paris Agreement. It played a very key role running up through the fall in the New York climate talks. And so I suggest that when we think about scale and we think about reaching a lot of people, that everybody be aware of what Pope Francis has done in this book, the encyclical. In chapter 3, he talks about the human roots of the ecological crisis. And he suggests that we need a new synthesis capable of overcoming the false assumptions of the recent century. What he's really talking about is worldviews and overcoming the entrenched, short-term, positivistic, reductionist, overly mechanistic worldview that we're all kind of running up against here. And that's why it's so, I think, fascinating that here at ASU and ISSST that you're through this lens of resiliency and infrastructure and engineering, also kind of motivated around this type of worldview. I want to touch on a piece that I know a member of your cohort has been inserting into your program, Johnny's work on integral, because chapter 4 of the encyclical is entitled Integral Ecology. And what Pope Francis is saying that we really need a comprehensive new economic ecology that is based on interaction with natural systems and social systems. And he inspires world leaders to think that way. So integral meaning complete. And what he talks about is really just a complete picture of reality. So I suggest that we integrate the Pope, if you will, get on the Pope-mobile, all of us, because here's a world leader who's taking big risks and putting himself out there and talking about an ecological worldview, and has already deeply inserted himself in world politics at scale, witness the Paris Climate Agreement. So what's interesting, and why I guess maybe I talk about the Pope in my talks, is around the same time that the encyclical came out, my book came out, and I also had a peer-reviewed article in this Journal of Management of Global Sustainability come out, which is the official journal of Jesuit business schools, and it was peer-reviewed by a number of Jesuit scholars around the world, and here a secular Jew ended up all of a sudden being interviewed by Catholic priests asking to interpret what the Pope was saying. It was surreal to say the least, and it ended me with this man. Giacomo Costa is a Jesuit priest scholar. He's the executive director for the San Fedeli Institute, and he is the one who translated the encyclical. He has one of the only signed copies of the encyclical from Pope Francis, and he is the one that entitled Chapter 4, Integral Ecology. And so when he invited me to come visit him, I said via email, and he was kind of in somewhat broken English, where is your office? And he said, just come up to the Duomo, and it's the door on the right. Well, I don't know how many of you have seen the Duomo in Milan, Italy, but it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. Like you're coming up to this just impossibly ornate giant building, and here I go to the door on the right, and we go through, and here's Giacomo, and he couldn't have been more delightful. And what he, I want to share with you one thing he said to me, because I'm going to bring it back to courage and something Thomas touched on, and I think all of you as scientists and physicists are aware of, which I'll call quantum social change. Giacomo told me that he thought in Italy, within a couple of weeks of the encyclical being published, that it erased 500 years of the separation between the church and science and big business in Italy. And I've sat there with that thought of, okay, the Pope is a change agent, ecological worldviews, 500 years of a social, cultural, psychological shift. So I invite us as change agents to kind of put this arrow in our quiver, that there is something mysterious about social change. Time allowing, I'll talk about a sociologist from the University of Norway who is the chair of the IPCC Adaptation Committee, Karen O'Brien, who also talks about quantum social change, and that there is something hard to reduce to a short-term linear causal relationship happening for all of us as sustainability change agents. And so this experience with Giacomo is kind of one that I've continued to anchor and think about what's possible in terms of how we might flip to some of the things we want to see happen, like a price on carbon and resilient, large-scale resilient cities across the country, that things are possible, and especially when we reflect on you know, what is in front of us today. So I think with a little bit of time, I want to just touch on a couple areas that that I think we're all going to relate to. And there's this big gap, and you're kind of stepping into the middle of it. There's a giant gap between sustainability practice, education, and leadership development. And these are some pictures on the bottom of some of the books and some of the mainstream books in the business world that get at this idea of interior leadership development. And it's not generally integrated into sustainability, and it's certainly not generally integrated into engineering schools or MBA programs. And that's what I think is a missing perspective related to harnessing the power of ecological worldviews for change. Now this is a picture of a place I call the High Camp up on my land, and it's of MBA students and environmental studies students and Native American drum and dance students. And we've done this every spring, and I've personally witnessed, by just having this cross-disciplinary experience embedded in nature with the magic of indigenous drumming. This is a picture of Brent Florendo, who's a Native American professor. We have a Native American Studies minor at Southern Oregon University. But this experience, more than any single experience, I've witnessed these kind of new levels of awareness in business students in particular. And I've continually reflected on the power of nature to mysteriously impact people's experience. And the question is, can you then anchor that? Can you then integrate it? And so what we do is we do personal sustainability projects that make it very personal. And this is something that came out of Walmart and Saatchi & Saatchi a decade ago, but we don't do it enough in all of these business programs, and we don't do it enough in corporations to make sustainability personal and anchor it in a personal way. Now here's one other personal experience I had. This is a picture standing in that same spot looking up the sky a few years later of a plane dropping fire retardant on a blaze that happened right next to my land. And as I ran around in an adrenaline-fueled haze, cutting down trees with a chainsaw, and my wife was emptying out the house of possessions, it dawned on me that this is kind of the face of climate change in the West. And something amazing happened that following spring. Beetles that had been flushed out of the fire landed up at the High Camp, and hundreds of ponderosa trees started to die from the top down. And it also dawned on me how little I understood about how really natural systems work. And this was just one example writ large of really what the whole planet is facing. And so as a former CEO, as a CPA, as a business professor, I thought, you know, how little I understand about the mystery of how the natural world works. So as I close, I want to talk about this experience I had with a gray whale. This is a gray whale in San Ignacio Lagoon in Mexico, and I'm leaning into her, and my hand is on her mouth, and she is looking me in the eye, and I am looking her in the eye, and she is responding to my touch and my voice. And it's a great story because they have created a refuge there, and the gray whales now number more than 25,000 compared to only a few hundred in the Western Pacific. And the amazing thing is that the president of Mexico at the time, in 2000, Ernesto Zedillo, had this same experience with his family, close to close, eye to eye, with this charismatic megafauna, these gray whales. And there's a lot more to the story with the NRDC and various NGOs, but at the time, Mitsubishi wanted to build a big salt plant. And Zedillo had this experience and put a stake in the ground to protect these whales. And we all know about the oceans here, we all know about indicators, but I think what we don't know enough is how these kind of experiences cause these epiphanies and scale and affect hundreds of millions of people. So I leave you with this image of this gray whale, and you know, we've had lots of models and maps and theories, and the science you do here is amazing. And that's so important. It's what creating knowledge is all about. But I think what I wonder is, in the end, what will matter even more is the extent that you can tap into your personal superpower and your courage to creatively communicate about sustainability. Thank you. You know, I'm a psychologist as well, and it's allowed me to reflect on who I am and where I'm from. And and bring a lot of religious dialogue. And it made me, there's these big movements. There's the eco-Jesuit movement, eco-Kashrut in Judaism, eco-Islam. I've been quoted in these blogs in the Middle East about ecological worldviews, and that kind of discussion, I think, is the kind of discussion that we need. In my own case, I'm aware that part of my intensity and my seriousness around sustainability is because I come from this kind of long line of Russian Jews culturally. I had some fun talking to Igor Linkov about that yesterday. And I've even become aware, that this is who I am. My parents were pretty serious secular Jews, but serious about the world. My mother, in particular, was always talking about global politics, and in somewhat of a pessimistic way, but a serious way. And I always thought, I wasn't exactly like her. I was more optimistic, and so I went into climate change. And I just thought I'd take the pessimism up a whole new notch. But I'd like to think she'd be proud of me. That she would have gotten a lot of mileage out of climate change, my mom.